Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Jack Harlow record, Jackman. It's funny talking about Jack Harlow now, just because it seemed like only a couple of years ago he was pretty much in everybody's good graces, as much as someone of his particular caliber of abilities can be. I mean, he's never been the best in terms of delivery, flow, lyricism even, but some solid bangers that really helped define the earliest moments of his career, like What's Poppin', as well as an above average feature on Lil Nas X's Industry Baby, one of the best pop rap songs of the past few years, ensured that he was someone that people were fine with the existence of. I mean, sure, again, he was never the most loved figure in the world, but despite the fact that he made simple, thin, and endurance lacking music, he had an endearing public persona and decent enough abilities behind the mic. So, people were pretty much fine with him. And then the almighty Come Home the Kids Miss You happened. The public reception of 2022's Come Home the Kids Miss You, his sophomore studio album, was about as much of a train wreck as you can possibly get as a major label artist, as a mainstream popular artist, especially as one of the most popular rappers on the entire planet at the moment. It was received so laughably badly, and it's not hard to see why. Maybe it got a bit too much hate at the time, but at the same time, there were some genuinely weak beats and some really horrible lyricism throughout that record that at least warranted the majority of the hate, if not all of it. No matter what your views on Harlow's sophomore effort were at the time, and no matter what your views on that record are now, it's no secret that a third studio album by him was always going to be a career-defining moment. The moment that saw if he was going to really stake his place in the music industry, or if it was going to be another piece of flaming garbage that would see him fizzle out completely, a la DaBaby. But his latest studio album, Jackman, his third effort overall, and the album that he decided to just announce randomly a few days before release, is actually it's pretty decent. It's pretty decent. Look, I'm not saying it's particularly great, but it's also not enough to continue the hate train that was going on after his last album, or more accurately, the hate train that went off the hate tracks into the hate canyon and then made a hate nuclear explosion at the bottom of the hate canyon. I think you kind of understand my point. It's not a great album. It's not a great album, but it's decent, and if anything, it marks a lot of improvements for Jack as a musician that are nice to see, even if it's in a just fine format. Perhaps the most important improvement that Jack sees himself create as an artist throughout the entirety of Jackman is the lyrical content itself. Now, of course, Jack is a musician that isn't necessarily meant to be some sort of master wordsmith or anything like that, but at the same time, the horrifically bad lyricism that was found throughout Come Home the Kids Miss You was largely the reason that album was targeted for being one of the worst albums of last year. And although I don't personally agree it was the worst thing in the world, I will agree that there's some pretty dreadful lyrics on there. Some of the worst songwriting of 2022 for sure. Like that line on Churchill Downs where he's talking about how his grandfather would have a heart attack if he pulled out 100 grand, so he's not gonna pull out 100 grand. I think it goes without saying that the songwriting on that album was pretty bad. Saying that Jack is suddenly an amazing songwriter that has completely progressed in every single way would be a complete and total fabrication, a lie, a fib, any other synonym of any of those words. That being said, it's obvious that he has grown artistically from this particular perspective. A couple of tracks here, such as Blame on Me, as well as the depressing yet gripping Gang Gang Gang, a really powerful reflection of childhood friends that grow up to be horrible human beings, are actually songs that feature an elevated level of storytelling that we've practically never seen from Jack before, and I have to say that if he goes in this direction in the future, he might put out an album that I would be comfortable with genuinely calling good and revisiting in the future. The same could be said about the instrumentation here as well, for the most part at least, and that isn't necessarily saying much that the instrumentation has improved here, as some of the different instrumentals that Jack has flowed over in the past have been pretty reminiscent of free stock beats that you would get from the most basic pop rap beat pack on the entire planet, but Jackman really does demonstrate a significantly higher degree of effort in terms of beat making from Jack and from a number of other people behind this album. Many of the beats found throughout the entirety of Jackman heavily rely on the sort of archetypal southern hip-hop style, which I mean, it fits. He is from Kentucky, after all. But tracks that are found throughout this album that rely on some of the more jazzy notes here, like It Can't Be, are more than pleasant, and some of these sped up chipmunk soul sort of samples that have really been a heavy part of hip hop for decades at this point, found on tracks such as Denver, are melodramatically nostalgic in the best way that they possibly could be. It doesn't necessarily feel corny, it actually feels legitimately emotional, which is not something that I expected to say about anything Jack Harlow did ever, but here I am. The nice thing about Jackman as a record is that it feels like Jack actually has an identity now, which is something that he has really lacked in the past. I mean, sure, his music and his general public persona has been based around this sort of laid-back, suave player, which is fine, but that gets a little old after one album, let alone two, and the fact that he's so consistently relied on that, whether it's honest to his true self or not, has really shown that he's a pretty much one-dimensional musician, at least up to this point. Jackman actually sees him get a little more reflective, sees him hone in on his influences a little bit more to make a unique amalgamation of a lot of sounds that inspire him as an artist. This is just a record that feels more Jack Harlow than anything that Jack Harlow has done in the past feels. This feels like what he should be doing. Look, seeing fresher and more well fleshed out instrumentation and more thoughtful lyricism throughout the entirety of Jackman is a nice change, to be sure. I'm certainly not complaining about either of those things. I am praising them above all else. But really, the thing that I value Jackman most in regards to what it changes for Jack Harlow as a musician is the fact that it actually develops his personality. It develops his voice out in the public as an artist. Now, is his next album going to be more like this? No, because this isn't the kind of style that's going to sell quite as well as his first two records, but at the same time, it's also nice to see him at least change things up a little bit to prove that he isn't some sort of semi-parody of modern hip-hop. I mean, really, this album has kind of shocked me in that manner. I mean, in the past, Jack has been only a step or two away from being in the realm of Young Gravy and other rappers that, although presenting themselves in a serious manner, are obviously meant to be somewhat ironic parodies of certain styles or certain brands, or even parodies of themselves. And you know what? Some musicians can do that well when they take it in a creative direction. One of the greatest musicians of the entirety of the history of rap was Kool Keith, who is still active today and still making great music. And he's also someone who's incredibly self-aware. But the thing about Kool Keith, and not that I'm saying that Jack and Kool Keith are similar, is that artists like Kool Keith have really gone in creative directions to make this sort of style that really blends the serious with the humorous, something unique, whereas Jack just kind of feels like he's trying to be comedic while also being serious about himself, and generally speaking, it comes across as pretty much Drake for people who are still too soft to listen to Drake, which is pretty soft. But here, it actually feels like he's trying to do something unique. And if that's branching off into this new direction that will define the future of his career, yeah, sure, that's great. And if it just means that he's taking a little sidestep to do something a bit more personal before getting back to what he did the first two times around, then that's perfectly fine too. Either of those things demonstrate creative progress for him in some regard, and that's a good thing to see, as it really does show that he has more than one side to him, and that he's actually willing to do something maybe a bit different, instead of just repeating the same album cycle over and over and over again. If, as an album, Jackman answered a question besides what would happen if Jack Harlow tried, it would be, what is the best format for Jack Harlow? And that's exactly this. This album, a brief record that has a fair amount to say and not a lot of time to add on to the fat. After all, even the best moments of Jack's career up to this point have been overshadowed by overly long album runtimes, as well as songs that think they have way more to say than they actually do, and generally speaking, he just hasn't found his artistic footing as a whole. Even, again, in the better moments of his career up to this point, he has still failed in some regard. With a 24-ish minute runtime and a certain self-awareness that is arguably more natural than anything Harlow has done in the past, Jackman is the record that answers what is best for Jack Harlow. This is an album that manages to feel a bit more heart-to-heart and honest as a whole, while still maintaining this sort of suave, laid-back coolness that ultimately defines his character in general. This doesn't feel like a totally new musician that's pandering towards a more lyrical, spiritual, miracle, hip-hop kind of crowd. This just feels like Jack Harlow doing something different that he legitimately wants to do while maintaining the things that made him popular in the first place. To put it simply, everything about Jackman as a record just works. That's really all there is that can be said about that. Everything just makes sense here, and to see Jack step away from some of the tropes that have practically defined him up to this point as a musician, to make something a bit more heartfelt while still maintaining some of the better qualities of himself as a musician that made him slightly stand out in the first place when he first started to get big just a couple years ago, makes for an album that is really pretty solid, and something that really manages to outshine practically everything else that he's done up to this point. Jackman was really always bound to be some sort of make or break scenario for Jack Harlow. I mean, one second he was one of the most non-hated rappers in the world, and then the next second nobody could stop talking about the fact that there is a certain pineapple related line on First Class. It really is insane, the trajectory of respect, the downhill trajectory, I should add, that people had for Jack Harlow the second that Come Home the Kids Miss You came out. An album that, although bad, maybe wasn't as bad as people really said it was. The truth is that Jack Harlow has never been one of the worst, nor has he been the best of the best, either. In fact, even in the landscape of modern mainstream rappers, Jack Harlow is the pinnacle of mediocrity, and with a number of rappers out there like Drake and a Boogie with the Hoodie, that's saying something. That's a pretty good achievement, being the pinnacle of mediocrity. With that in mind, Jackman is a solid enough step in the right direction, and easily the best album in his discography up to this point. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.